Hey, Val, how are you?
Again, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I want to credit you for coming up with this sort of idea of asking every guest before I start what the idea of being Vietnamese or the just idea of Vietnam, what it means to them. Can we talk about sort of how how that came about?
Sure. I recall it. You were thinking about a question, sort of an anchor question, right, for your podcast. And originally, it was going to be, "Have you been to Vietnam?" And that's a good question to ask, but it's a yes or no question.
Right.
I think I was like, "Well, what's something that's more open ended?" And it also is a sort of an ode to one of my favorite podcasts, On Being, with Krista Tippett, and she asked the question, what was your spiritual background growing up? And so I think asking what Vietnamese, the term Vietnamese uh, is sort of loaded in many ways, and so I thought that that's sort of a good comparison question to what your spiritual background is, because Vietnamese identity is so malleable.
We spend a lot of time together talking about that idea of being Vietnamese. Can you tell me a little bit about what it means for you?
I should have prepared better because I knew you were going to ask this question. But
We can move on to another topic and then come back
no,
to
no,
it.
no. I feel like we're going to have a long conversation, so we should just hit
Yeah.
them one by one, I
All right.
suppose. What does it mean to be Vietnamese? Um, for me, I've had the fortune of being able to live in Vietnam, right, and also living in America, and I think that's really helped me inform what being Vietnamese is to me. And um, it's not necessarily a singular identity. It's very much a complex identity because it's one that is sort of attached to all these hyphenated identities all over the world, because there's a diaspora, there's a refugee community that dispersed, that a lot of people dispersed after 75. And because of that, I think it's almost um, sort of parallels a Jewish identity in many ways. When people say they're Jewish, you sort of can lock in that to Israel for some people, but it's much more expansive than that. And um, and I always talk about the idea of, when I'm in Vietnam, I feel very American, but or honestly, mostly anywhere else in the world other than America. But when I'm in America, I feel very very Vietnamese. And um, I mean, identity is a tricky thing. So I don't think of, being Vietnamese as truly identity, because it really encompasses so much of my life and what I do and how I live my life, and like the actions that do. And um, it is me. Vietnamese is me as much as American is me. We all sort of have, again, these complex identities, complex characteristics and traits of ourselves. And I think for me, it's part of the continuing search of who I am always. And I think it's fluid. It's never stagnant. I'm always figuring out, like, the same question of what it means to be human, which is also a question that Krista Tippett asked on her podcast. Like, what does it mean to be Vietnamese? And that's a question that I can't really answer right now, because it's something I'm still searching for.
Do you think 30 years, 300 years from now, being any particular anything matters? Do you think being or retaining this identity or even talking about it right now on a podcast even matters 300 years from now when we're all blended and everybody's, like what's that movie with Kevin Costner, Waterworld, and everybody's sort of like the same tone? Is it important that we even kind of even ask ourselves this question?
Totally. I think, like, celebrating difference is very important to the experience of society and being a human and feeling like you belong to a community. I think people tend to want to find the commonality all the time. And I think that is sort of a very superficial way to look at the way we live, because if we don't distinguish difference, then we don't kind of distinguish suffering, we don't distinguish class, we don't distinguish um, discrimination, prejudice, when all these things will exist. And even in 300 years, when people think that, the way that the world is moving, maybe there will be attributes that are very similar and identities will feel the same, but there will be a way where certain people, certain classes will put down another group because say, well, 300 years ago, your family was Vietnamese, but my family was XYZ. So there's always, I think it's human instinct, for better, for worse, to create these hierarchies. And I don't think, you know, 300 years from now, there's going to be some utopia where everyone's equal. And I think the idea of difference is important. Audre Lorde talks about, she was this feminist writer, and and she was a African American feminist writer, and a lot of white feminists were like, oh, you don't try to distinguish yourself as a black feminist and white feminists, we're all feminists. And she's like, no, I come from a very specific background in that we have to acknowledge that difference in order for us to move forward and try to build more like justice and equitable societies. We need to realize that there are differences that divide us, that create systemic racism, that create systemic inequality. And I would like to think that some of those systemic challenges and things that distinguish us on that level will sort of go away. But I don't think our identities, just because we might all look in a similar fashion, that the way we treat each other will be that different, to be honest.
These are all very nuanced details. They're talking about an idea of being Vietnamese or the identity. When I think about you in the early days of meeting you, and my earliest recollections of who you are, weirdly, I think about a photographer shooting rock concerts, right? I mean, that's my earliest sort of thoughts of what you did professionally. Can you take me? I know that there's much more to you than that particular period in time, but I've never really kind of asked you about that. But I'm curious about that particular point in your formation. Can you tell me a little bit about the photography that you did in New York and how you got into it?
Sure. So I was, I think, right after I graduated from college, I went to NYU, and I graduated with a politics international relations degree, and I was planning to be a lawyer for a long time, but I always had this sort of passion for visual arts, visual storytelling, especially photography and cinema. And I bought myself a digital camera as like a graduation gift to myself. I was like, okay, well, I went 4 years. I got my undergraduate in a degree that I thought my parents would want me to have. So this is sort of a creative gift to myself. And I mean, I don't remember necessarily like the very first concert I went to with my camera, but I remember just going there. And I've always been a person who looks at the world in a very visual and spatial way. And when I went to a concert, even before I brought my camera, I'd always just imagine myself taking pictures, or like just really admiring how the lighting of a concert, or sort of the setup, and how a performer moved, and how I would love to capture that on film. And so yeah, I just brought a camera to a concert one day, and this is like before iPhones. This is like 2000, 2006. And so, when you go to a concert today, there's every single person has their iPhone up and they're actually watching the concert primarily through their
Screen.
their screen, right? But back in the day, people weren't taking out their phones, and actually, not a lot of people had digital cameras too. And so it was a different time. It's crazy just in the span of like 15 years how concerts have changed. And yeah, I brought my camera and I just like took some photos and I kept on going to concerts. Me and my freshman year roommate Christopher Kelly, he was a musician, and we used to go to concerts like 3 or 4 times a week in New York. It was great. You can go to like Radiohead one night and then
Oh,
like Wu Tang Clan the next night, and it was just so. It was like being a college student. You want to just immerse yourself. You're so young and energetic. You want to like be part of that energy. And New York, obviously, like every big act toured New York. It was definitely like one of their first stops on their big tours. Um, and yeah, I just started taking photos and I started posting it. I think Flickr had just started, and I started posting photos, and that was like blogs were just blowing up, and my people would just start using. They would just take. I would put like a Creative Commons license on it, which basically just says anyone could use it, and people would take my photos and just credit me and link back to my Flickr, and within a few months, like I would see that my my Flickr account would get like 10,000 views in a photo or something. And I'm like, who is like looking at my photos? And I could tell, you could see where it was being linked from. And I'd see all these blogs that would just use my photos. And I was like, well, this is cool, but it's also like, how do I monetize this? And
right.
how do I make this into some sort of take some utility out of this, right? And so I would contact the editors of these blogs, and they were just starting with these blogs, which they're huge now, like Brooklyn Vegan, Stereo Gum, Pitchfork. These were just like really small blogs at the time. And I was like, hey, you're using my photo. Thanks for the credit. If you need like staff photographers, I'm down. And I was literally like the first staff photographer of Brooklyn Vegan, which is a huge music site in New York. It's like millions of unique visitors today. But at the time, he was just a vegan in Brooklyn. That's why it's called Brooklyn Vegan. But yeah, over time, I started going to concerts. I'd shoot like 2 concerts a night, and then Rolling Stone contacted me. Like the New York Times used my photos, and it just kind of expanded from there. And I just love the idea of like capturing another art form through my art form, right? Capturing music through photography, and how it was almost a challenge to me. How do you take an image, a single image of a musical moment? And it was, yeah, it was, I mean, really fun times. It was like really wild times in New York actually too.
In the early days, having that digital camera, were you given access in the very before the big blogs or magazines would reach out to you? Were you given access to the stage, or how did you get shots that were, you know, able to be of any quality, if you weren't given access to the stage or backstage?
Um, I went to a lot of like small shows first, like a lot of club shows, and you can kind of like sneak your way up this top. And my friend Chris, he would go to the shows with me, and he just has no shame, and he would just you know plow through to the front, and he would just take my arm and pull me, and we'd get to the front of like Radiohead, and like I remember seeing Coldplay with like 90 people, and I shot Adele's very first concert in America. It was at this place called Joe's Pub. It
And,
was
and you aren't being commissioned for any of that yet.
the Joe's Pub one was, but like Coldplay, Radiohead, no. I would just I buy a ticket, and I actually this is post 9/11, so there was security, but they weren't checking for cameras. And I would sometimes sneak it in if they would. Sometimes they would start being pretty. uh, anal about like bringing in cameras. So I'd bring my book bag and I'd like stuff it with dirty underwear and like gym clothes, and I'd surround my camera with this stuff. And then they would open it, they would immediately see the dirty gym clothes and they would not want to go through it. And then I just, I went in with
Fucking
my camera.
brilliant. Fucking brilliant. It's like so smart. Wow, that you think back a lot of people that get started in any industry, or would you say that that's sort of like the start of where directing and all of your sort of art pursuit came from?
No, I would say like the very first time that I thought I like actually had some artistic talent was I was 15. I was taking like a photography class. One of the first assignments was to make a pinhole camera, right? That's like the OG type of cameras. You basically just take like a shoebox, put a hole in it, and you put a piece of photographic paper on the other end, and you point it at something for X number of seconds, and it would create an image. And I remember, it was sophomore year of high school, and I went outside and I saw a rear view mirror, and I took a photo of this rear view mirror, just thinking, oh, this is like interesting shape. The light is hitting in a certain way. I don't know what the image is going to look like, right? That's how film used to be. And a week later, my teacher, the photography teacher, was just like, hey, we just developed all the classes pinhole photos, and there was one photo that stood out, and it really blew my mind because it's such an abstract image and it takes you so long to understand what it is. And all the years I've been teaching photography, I don't think I've seen a first image like this. And then I was just like playing around with my friends, like talking to my classmates, like not even listening to what she was saying. And then she took out my photo, and it really blew my mind because for the longest time, I mean, we can go back to like when I first started getting the visual arts, but like for a long time, I've been into visual arts by like sketching and drawing, and I made some shorts before, but I never had that reinforcement from someone who had a bit of authority, right? This is my art teacher, my
Right.
photography teacher, and to have that um, reinforcement, that validation from someone, especially when you're young in a creative field when it's very subjective, it really, I think, inspired me to that I had some talent in visual storytelling or visual art, and I always sort of remember that moment in when I'm making something today and I feel unsure of myself, that me pointing a camera at something unknown could create something that was so um, impactful on someone. It's that's for me. That's the beauty of art, like creating something meaningful out of thin air in many ways.
Okay, let me all right, let's backtrack to that pinhole camera. Because was it by design? Did you actually know that what you were creating was something abstract, somebody's going to appreciate on the other end, or at least something that's like cool? Or was it just an assignment, you just really didn't think about it, you just kind of went through it? Did you design it? Did you have intention?
Yeah, I mean, I had intention that what I saw at the time was beautiful to me, and I captured it, but I didn't. I think I was too young. I or I mean, sometimes people think like, I mean, art and creativity is not learned. It's something born, and it's intuition. And I don't know. I can't answer that question. I think you can definitely work on your art and get better, but sometimes it's also random and lucky too, to be completely honest. And um, I remember just being a rush that class was about to end, and I was out. I had the camera, and I saw something interesting, and I captured it. And that's kind of the story. If it was intentional, I mean, the intention is cap. I think the intention of art is to capture beauty, and for me, in many ways. So that's what I went out to do that day, and I didn't think anything of it until, I think validation. People might say like validation is overrated, but we're making. I think as artists, we're for me, I think it would be a selfish endeavor to think of art as something purely for yourself. That it is part of an audience. Like even the idea of cinema, like there's a difference between someone who made they say the Lumiere brothers created cinema, but they didn't actually make the first motion picture.
Right.
But the distinction of making cinema is different because they made a motion picture for an audience. And that's what cinema is, right? It's not just creating the physical object of a motion picture, but making a motion picture for someone to see it and feel it and find meaning in it. And I think that's sort of, I understood that in that moment when I made something and I someone else appreciated it, right? There was a audience response to what I made.
Okay, we're gonna go back to this whole rock music photography, but I'm gonna make a weird, strange segue right now that has everything to do with what you just said. And you can tell me if you don't want to talk about it, all right? There's a piece of artwork directly behind you. Can you talk about that? The brown piece of art on on the wall.
Yeah, it's like an $8,000 piece I bought from Sotheby's. Um,
Has anybody ever asked you about that? I mean, on a
yeah,
podcast?
no, I mean, they say it's beautiful. They're like, "What is this wood piece of art behind you?" Like the structure, but a lot of people know the story. So you're not breaking any news here, Ken.
No, I didn't. I've always wanted to hear the real explanation of really having the balls to put something up. Like I wouldn't like be able to defend it, right? And something that you and I, it's a theme that
But
we
what do
talk
you see
about.
first before I answer the question? What do you see? Like not knowing what it is, what does it look like to you?
Are you asking me as a friend that has been over your house before and
I'm asking you as someone who's never, as a listener or viewer of your podcast, like not knowing anything. What would you interpret it as?
I don't we can't see the whole thing. We can
Okay.
only see a part of it. But if we did see the whole thing, okay, to answer that question, I'd be one of the first guys to say, you know what, I am kind of intimidated to answer what I really believe that that is, right? Just my personality, I'm unsure. And I always marvel at the fact that you're very sure of the decisions that you make in the movies that you put together, in the dishes that you make for dinners with our friends. Um, and then you put up that piece of art, and I think it's symbolic of the courage of somebody who's willing to make art and defend it. You know, it's representative of who you are, and I kind of wanted to get to that, right? I want to fish for that sort of angle.
Well,
Not really what it
it's very
I don't
kind.
really care what it is. I just want to kind of hear sort of like your
Okay, well, very kind of you to say all that. It's something I made from the packing material that I had when I moved into this place. I was looking for art to put up on the wall, like I was going to put up a friend's photograph, a painting, but I really loved the texture of this packing material, and I knew I was just going to throw it out. And so it reminded me of a lot of art that I've seen, and there was I the texture of it is really interesting, and you can form it into many things. And also, it reminded me of the material you find in a bird's nest. And I thought, having moved into a new place, this art also symbolizes the idea of a nest, building a nest and building a home and building a place of shelter. And I just threw up on the wall, and every, when I first put it up, it's very flimsy. So every morning it would change shape, and I thought that was really interesting
Mhm.
too. Because like every day I wake up and this art kind of morphs into something new, and I thought it was just going to be temporary, but it's been up for almost a year now. And I think people, I'm used to it. It's something that creates a sense of it's like a natural material that adds um, a little hominess to. I live in a loft, so it's very industrial, and having this gives it, I guess, sort of a more organic feel in a way. Um,
Yeah, I'm not trying to break new ground. I just kind of wanted to hear.
okay, but yeah, I mean, I was just like, I'm trying to be more intentional, even like what I do with my waste, right?
Yeah.
What with the materials that I throw out, like how can I utilize things that I was planning to throw out, and how do I be more intentional about the materials that I use in my life, and like the meaning behind each piece of art um, in my living space.
Okay. So when you're putting up something like that, you don't have all the words you just expressed to me. You don't have all that figured out. Those words have to come over time, right? So when the act of putting something like that up, did you think about, were you concurrently thinking about what you just explained to me, or did it come as an impulse when you were like playing with that thing and you're just like, oh, let me put it up? And I guess what I'm asking is was it a gradual process, or you looked at it, you were inspired by the meaning of it, and you put it up, and it was a very quick thing?
Uh, you know, I'm speaking for this specific piece. I guess it was a gradual process. Um, I when I was younger, I dabbled in sculpture too, and painting, and just mixed media art. And um, I I was at the time I was just like, oh, this aesthetically, it'll be aesthetically pleasing, right? And it's not. I'm not throwing out all this material. So those two aspects of this piece were immediate. But like in terms of it being like the symbolism of it being a nest, it was until I put it up there that 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 really sort of solidified in my mind that, oh, this looks like a nest. So there's it's not just aesthetic quality, and I think that's how I view art in general. Is like in the initial creation of something, you have one intention, but as you keep on creating it, and when you finish it, the meaning evolves. And um, again, that's what I'm drawn to in sort of art, social sciences, that it's not necessarily fixed. Everything is
Mhm.
evolving.
And that's the process that I think many modern day humans, we sort of get fixated on the end product, the end result, and we just kind of want to force a story that we're shaping, a song that we're writing, a poem. We want it to come out a certain way because we think in our head, it's got to be delivered a certain way. But really, it's along the journey to get to that sort of end product is so ever changing. And it's hard to be reminded of that all the time when we're in such a delivery line oriented world.
Like, I try to think of like we talk about this a lot, and just as a refresher to your listeners, the idea of intention behind your choices, and it's not the how, but the why of things. And for me, I think I like to think, and a lot of people think this, like obviously human beings we're part of nature, right? Um, so everything we create, our inventions are an extension of nature. Therefore, our art is nature as well. So everything we create is nature, and that's our kind of connection to the natural world. and not just the connection that is the natural. We are the natural world. Everything that is created is the natural world because of that. But at the same time, because we're human, and what distinguishes us from, say, other animals that don't have the sort of um, consciousness of what they create, or what they create is very utilitarian or functional. That's what makes it different. Like the reason that people might say, why do we need art? That uh, why are we funding arts, and why aren't we just saving people from world hunger and giving people shelter? It's like we're art, science, music, movies, culture, they're all trying to they're tools to help us realize what it means to be human, to define the meaning of being human in many ways. And that's where you kind of distinguish between the creation of something and the meaning of something, right? And I think that is a process that I've kind of been honing and thinking about in everything I create, is like, the process of making something and how that brings me joy, but also the meaning and the value it can create once it's done. And then not just the value it gives me, but the value it gives everyone who looks at it, and what meaning that they place on that same object that I might not have intended, right?
It reminds me a lot about how messy life is. Really messy. What we just went through in the last 4 years politically here in the United States. It's a messy, um, really ugly feeling that we went through. But we've talked a lot about how, in order for things to kind of arrive at where they do, we kind of have to go through that process. It's very much like love, almost, right? We sometimes get into these really gnarly fights with our family, our lovers, or um, but we don't realize where the end game is. And I think that's how sometimes we end up in divorce, or we end up breaking up, because we don't see sort of like the where we land at the end of it all. And this idea, like, I think I come from a little bit different generation than you do. And I like to talk to you about this, segue into this idea of like your generation and the way you guys see love. And I'm on the tail end of like this older generation. Really, we don't, especially Vietnamese Catholics, we don't, want to ever divorce. We come from this sort of like rigid way of looking at it. But for you, this idea of love is very messy. And at what point do you say, okay, I'm going to keep working out the through the journey, and love is, and be as open as I possibly can, or I'm like 2 years into this, I got to get out. Or you get married and you're 13 years into it and you're like, I'm out. At what point does it stop? Because I know that the idea of being messy is, you're very comfortable in that sort of space.
I mean, messy is what define messy to me, because messy can mean a
Unpredictable.
lot of things. Uncomfortable.
Unpredictable. Yeah, it's uncomfortable. It can be violent, and I don't mean physically violent, but I mean violent in fighting and disagreeing, being polar opposites. That's messy.
Yeah, I mean, I for me, as you know, and I've gone through a lot of heartbreak in my life, and I think that's made me a better person in many ways. Made me to be hopefully a better partner to my future partner, and it's made me re-examine a lot of the assumptions that I've had of relationships, and expectations that I might have had of my partner. Um, but I think there's like this really beautiful idea that you know that I've had my heart broken so many times that at this point I've decided just to leave my heart open because it's so broken, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That
that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
because it's been battered and shattered so many times, instead of trying to fix it, because it's been shattered. It just remains open instead of thinking it's been shattered.
Yeah,
Like,
that takes a lot of courage though, for even to even fathom that you're gonna just keep it open for more destruction and for more mess, right? That takes a lot of strength to have the confidence to say, "Oh, it's gonna turn out to be okay." That
well,
takes
it doesn't even have to turn out to be okay, right? It's like, I mean, I guess I'm a Scorpio, for better for worse, and what people have their assumptions about Scorpios that we're very passionate, and I think the highest form of human emotion is love, right? And I think for love in order for that to be the highest form of human emotion and feeling, then you have to be willing to feel the exact opposite of that when you're rejected, or you know when it swings completely the other way. How can you experience the highest form of human emotion and the greatest joy without being willing to experience the greatest pain? And that's how I see it.
Yeah, I see it in the way you create too, because it takes a certain fearlessness, I think, to put your vulnerable thoughts out on a page or on screen. And I've gone through this so much in my life that you I think a lot of artists struggle with putting their own essence out there, and I'm just speaking for myself now. It's really scary. And the idea of having this open heart that's been trampled on um, allows you to really receive more and receive deeper.
I mean, I think it's true, the adage that, the greatest art comes from heartbreak and grief, and because you leave yourself vulnerable. I think because you're willing to kind of bear it all out there without any sort of inhibition and self doubt, that's leaves you open to kind of creating whatever and not really caring so much. And um, yeah, I mean, let's not get it wrong that I don't have uncertainty when I do something, but I'm always thinking like, everyone else around me is going to doubt me. I shouldn't doubt myself.
Yeah, you say that very often. Living in Vietnam, I haven't spent the amount of time that you have there. I've been back and forth a lot, and I've noticed that this idea of vulnerability in society, in families, we can't really communicate openly. I don't know. Maybe I hope I'm not crossing the line with saying such a general statement, but how do you feel about that? Do you feel like there's sort of sometimes there's walls that are, and let's talk about just being within our own families, that there's this inability to sort of really connect on that vulnerable level between ourselves and our parents?
I think, I'm only speaking from me and sort of my experience, and because, or I mean, hopefully it's relatable to people out there, but I'm reminded of, like, yeah, when my parents, or for many of our parents, when they came over to America, they were much younger than us. They were coming without knowing anything about the place they were going, right? For the most part. And I remember that we've had a conversation where you don't consider it a sacrifice. Them coming over wasn't a sacrifice.
Yeah,
And
we can get
yeah,
into that.
yeah,
That's
we can get into that. And you're right. In many levels, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was sort of a survival. It
yeah,
was just a mode of survival.
Yeah, I
Um,
hope I don't get flack for that, because it's a very blanket statement. Well, we definitely need to get in deeper with what I meant by that. But yeah, I just don't want people to take it out of context. Like they
yeah,
did.
I mean, but it's a part of like the complexity of our experience, right? That I don't think you can make a blanket statement and say like everything that is a sacrifice, right? Like what, but you know, I think heroism and sacrifice becomes synonymous a lot of times in courage. And I think what they did was very courageous, but it's not necessarily sacrifice. But that's your opinion. And for me, I think one sacrifice you make is a sacrifice of totally giving up on your country or what you thought was your country. And sacrificing that, the idea that Vietnam will never be the same Vietnam that you knew it, and that you're going to sacrifice the idea of a homeland and make a new one, right? And so you're sacrificing a part of yourself in that way. You're sacrificing a part of your identity because you're sacrificing, quote unquote, your homeland, your motherland, and what that means. And I always think of our parents as the greatest artists because they had the power to imagine a completely new future and a new home out of nothing. I think that that art of creation is very beautiful. And I don't think it's given enough credit to our parents' generation to have that sort of artistry, that imagination. Um,
It's a good point.
but you know, our relationship with our parents and their, especially with the way that they've raised us, it's easy. It's sort of um, simplistic to say, well, they didn't raise us like Americans. We have this immigrant background. It it was hard for XYZ, but you know, we should have the sense of empathy in a way that what they were going through at that time, they had to raise children in a new country uh, after leaving their country and losing their country in many ways. And so, how much I think over time I've thought about that and like how the choices that they made when they were younger were based, and my disappointment with their choices were based on
Yeah.
expectations that were not fair, expectations that were created out of a mythology of the American dream of the nuclear family, of what I saw on television of white picket
Yeah.
fences and white American families that, you know, their parents would say, I love you, and come home and play baseball with them, and all these things that my parents had no context, right? They had no education into that world. So those expectations were unfair. Not to say that they get a pass on everything because of that, but I think if we are to think of of um, of their sacrifice in that way, then we can we can create a better understanding of their life. And even, you know, my parents moved back to Vietnam. They live. My dad still lives in Vietnam. My mom's sort of trans-Pacific right now. And there's a lot of families who won't go back to Vietnam, right? They have a very sort of bad relationship and bad experience with the country. And I think a lot of people in our generation sort of gloss over that,
Yeah.
even in our conversations with today in a political level of like progressives versus conservative Vietnamese. Like, we're like, oh, why can't you just get over it in many ways? Like, get over the pains of your past. And sometimes we're too busy ignoring the bitter for the beautiful, they would say, people might say, right? And I think we need to recognize the bitter and the beautiful coexisting at the same time. Like there's a total right for people to be bitter because their country was taken away from them, or you know, their livelihoods were stolen. But there's also a beauty in being able to live in a country where you can um, profess your love for Vietnam, for you can put up a Ho Chi Minh photo, and that freedom is also something to be celebrated. And I think it's just those complex, uncomfortable conversations that we aren't having with our parents or these generations, where it's a dualistic society. It's contrast and not complexity. And I think the world needs more complex conversation.
Why do you think we're not able to simply bridge that divide?
Um, I mean, I think we're trying to. I think your podcast is a tool for that, to bridge divides. Um, you know, the prominence of social media, of cable news, of debate that is less um, contemplative and more combative, right? There's that proliferation of competition rather than cooperation. It's all these different things. Yeah.
Are you hopeful that we one day will be able to see the or contemplate have our community, our Vietnamese community throughout the whole world being able to contemplate and sort of sit on the differences and just share it and be in the space together and share the space together of right, left differences. Are you
Um,
hopeful?
I don't even know it's like hope is the right word. You know, for me, like the little moments are enough for me. I don't want necessarily, or I don't believe that we're all going to come together and agree on everything. And, but I think there's room for civil discourse between logical,
But
rational
it's
human
not
beings.
happening, is it? I don't I don't feel like it's happening. I mean, that's in part why I'm like I'm so gung ho about doing what we're doing right now is to sort of expand this idea of being comfortable with sitting with both sides and just sitting in each other's pain almost. But I'm not
Yeah,
hopeful like
I,
you are.
I think it starts though with you have to sort of have like some form of objectivity and almost moral objectivity, right? And when 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 there's not an objective standard of what the truth is and what fact is, then it's hard to have those conversations between people. Because if there's not a way to have, I believe in subjectivity for sure, in opinion and art and things that are subjective. But then when we're talking about things where there is objective truth, there's a difference between truth with a capital T and truth with a lowercase t, right? And the idea that one truth, the objective truth is something that it's subjective, then that's when you kind of get in these arguments. And I think it's hard to, and you're not trying to convince people, but you are trying to have, again, civil discourse. But it's hard to have a civil discourse when the the objective line is totally different, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it goes back to like misinformation and your sources of information.
All
And
of
I
this
mean, we're speaking specifically about politics. I know that's what we're speaking about, and um, so I think it comes down. It's more a systemic thing that has to be worked out on a root level in order for us to really think about these other conversations. Because if someone says the sky is blue and the other person says the sky is green, then how do you have a civil discourse about that?
and that's why I'm not hopeful because this stuff is so unclear anymore. Is this going on in Vietnam in terms of sort of societal disagreements? Do you feel the polarizing sort of people taking sides of whatever if it's politics or way of life in Vietnam? Is this sort of polarization happening in Vietnam, or is it just unique to the Vietnamese American experience today?
Um, I this is just based on my experience. I'm not an expert in sort of like comparative culture, but from my experience, most people will just not be like Vietnamese locals might just not engage in a political conversation. It hasn't been part, and this is to say, you a certain type of education system there where politics is not, that sort of political discourse is not encouraged,
Or, yeah.
and it's part of, yeah. While
Well,
here,
here,
very much encouraged. It's, civics education is like a pillar of the American education system, for better or for worse.
yeah, it's almost like I think when I had first started to meet all of the filmmakers, I always thought that's just it's all about just a beautiful story, putting together something like that can kind of move you emotionally. And the more that I've been able to spend time with you and other filmmakers, I realize that everything that we watch has some sort of political, not direct message, but it has a viewpoint. And maybe American cinema, being able to kind of have that freedom to kind of express viewpoints, it's inextricably tied to our freedom to be politically expressive and open. The more that I get to know you, the more I learn about how important politics are, and being open to learning about the nuances of politics. Where did that come from for you?
Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so right outside the seat of American power, you could say. And I think being that proximity to the American seat of power always piqued my interest. And I was, all most of my um, classmates' parents worked in the government, and like the customers at my parents' store were working in the government, either as diplomats or bureaucrats in most cases. And so I think that, yeah, just made me interested in that. And I always saw. I remember, my high school was John F. Kennedy High School, and the values of John F. Kennedy were literally plastered on the wall, right? And he was a president, I think more than any other president in American history, really valued the role of the citizen in government and in creating a better and just country. I mean, you can argue that President Obama did that as well, but I think sort of the modern model of that was created by John F. Kennedy.
He wrote Profiles in Courage, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I remember there was this class in sophomore year. Sophomore year apparently was very formative for me. Um, Sophomore year of high school, there was a class, NSL, National State Local Government class, taught by Mr. Griffith. That I was my one of my favorite classes of all time. And we would just watch speeches by John F. Kennedy. We would learn about the creation of the Peace Corps. I remember watching like Kennedy's inaugural speech during that class, and it ignited in me the sense of civic duty that I don't think I ever had before. I mean, we had debates because there were students who wouldn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and we had these really long debates in class with these students of why they weren't standing, and just like feeling engaged as an adult, having that sort of political discourse as a 15-year-old with other 15-year-olds, and then a man who came of age during Kennedy's years. It was very enlightening, and I keep on using the word formative, but it was all these past experiences in my life. I think of how they're formative and make me who I am today. And I think that class definitely had an impact on me. And for me, I think when people make films and they say there's no politics involved, like the act of it having no politics involved is a political act,
Right.
right? Um, and um, and the idea of politics has been tainted for the past 4 years, or you can say for a long time. But I always thought of politics as the debate between competing interests to serve the common good. That might be a very utopian version of politics, but that's how I always saw it. And if you look at politics, you look at all these debates through that lens, then it creates a sense. I wouldn't even say it's not idealistic, but there's a level of pragmatism and idealism in that statement. Like, I don't think Republicans on some, piece of the legislation are necessarily doing something to intentionally disenfranchise a community. They're doing it because it's in the best interest of their constituents, and in because of that, it might be disenfranchising a community, but they don't look at it that way. But so if you look at, they're in a way they're trying to better their community or to better their interests. It's selfish, but it's still the idea of striving for a more perfect union, right? For them, at least. So that's why I I tend to not take politics personally, which is a strange comment to make in today's day and age. I like to think of like when someone makes or believes in something that's different than my opinion, where did they come from? What was their experience to form that opinion? And and how do I put myself in those shoes to understand where they're coming from when I have a debate with that person and I have a policy disagreement?
It's hard to remind ourselves every time we run into people who are different than us. I think our emotions just sort of just take over.
Yeah, it's a practice for sure.
Very hard to be mindful of another
And
person's.
that's my opinion. I mean, there's uh, again, I'm speaking for myself, and I know people who have been historically disenfranchised by policies. Obviously, they have a right to be angry and feel like they're not seen and feel invisible by these policies. So, at the, I hear that and see that as well.
You mentioned coming from the seat of the country, DC, political. Did you say political seat of the country, DC? Did you work in DC politics at all? Did you spend some time in that field?
Yeah, for a long time. I mean, if people don't know, I'm a filmmaker because I don't even think we talked about that at all. So I
I'm actually intentionally doing that because
okay, I know you are, but just I have to give context to some people. So before I became a filmmaker, I was very much on a path to the political world, to a political career. I was planning to be a lawyer, but like human rights lawyer, international law, uh, specializing in international law. And yeah, I always dreamt of like, oh, I want to be a UN ambassador or a diplomat or win, be a Nobel Peace Prize winner, laureate, right?
Mhm.
And sorry, what was the question?
Did you ever work in DC?
Okay,
Yeah,
so yeah, I did. I was briefly in the Peace Corps. I lived in Kyrgyzstan.
I never knew that.
Okay, yeah, I lived in Kyrgyzstan before I met you, 2007. I
How
left
long?
not very long, like a summer. I left for some personal reasons
But wait,
and
let's talk about it. I never
Kyr-
even.
okay,
Wait, where is that in the world? Pardon my ignorance. I have
yeah,
no idea, but can we talk
it's
about that?
near Afghanistan, Kazakhstan. It's
Yeah.
one of the
So
stands, obviously.
yeah, so it's 3 months roughly. And what did you do?
I was okay. So, you know, taking a few steps back. I joined the Peace Corps. I I was like, oh, I wish I could go teach English in Fiji or something, some cush job, or like work in like economic development, community development, and somewhere in Asia, to be honest. Technically, Kyrgyzstan is Central Asia. I remember getting the call, and they're like, "Oh, you just got stationed in Kyrgyzstan," and I'm like, "Is that a country? I've never heard of Kyrgyzstan."
Borat.
This is right at the time Borat was big, so I'm like, "Don't you mean Kazakhstan?" They're like, "No, Kyrgyzstan." I'm like, "Okay, I have to look it up immediately." And I went to Kyrgyzstan. To be honest, it was right at the time that my sister um, was pregnant with with her first child. And my sister and I quite close. And when I was in Kyrgyzstan, um, I was with a host family, and there was like a little baby there, and I just felt like kind of I didn't want to miss the feeling of being there for my nephew's birth, right? It was like I and just I think the pains of being isolated in a country like Kyrgyzstan, which is a very isolated country and it's something dramatically different than what I'm used to. All of those things like um, just created this abundancy of fear and isolation. And
What were you doing there? What was your mission?
I was teaching English. That was going to be
That
my
was it. The Peace Corps sent you there to teach English.
and I mean, it shows the power of language too, right? What you think you want to. I had a lot of before that. I mean, sort of. I'll quickly answer your other question. Like I had worked for AmeriCorps. I was building like development programs for immigrant communities post 9/11, trying to redevelop Lower Manhattan and Chinatown, and I was really interested in the idea of like rebuilding the community after tragedy, after something as horrific as 9/11, and I thought, oh, I can do that in Kyrgyzstan or somewhere else in the world, like a post-war society. I was very interested in development post-war in post-world societies, post-conflict societies. But they're just like, we need English teachers. I mean, that's what these countries need in order to they felt develop. Is like that is
Mm.
a huge um, tool that people use to just to progress in their own development, but also a country's development. It shows how Western centric the world is, and for better for worse. But that's what they wanted me to do. So I learned Russian for a little bit. I'm don't recall any Russian anymore, but I lived there. I taught English. Lived with a close family. But I was dying to go back. This is 2007, summer 2007, and I went back, and I don't have any regrets because after I witnessed the birth of my nephew, I went to work on the Obama campaign, which was the most life changing experience of my life.
How so?
Um, just I think I on sort of symbolic level, seeing someone and having a candidate with the name Barack Hussein Obama, first of all, believe that he could be president was inspiring. Just the very thought of him being president was inspiring for me. I think many, um, you know, immigrant children who always felt unseen growing up, especially immigrant children with a funny name. Um, so that was one reason it was life changing. But meeting all these people from all over the world really that wanted to become part of this one mission to get this one person elected, and that collective sense of purpose was something I'd never experienced before in my life. I mean, we had volunteers fly over from the UK, from Greece, from Japan on their own dime to volunteer for a
Wow.
president that they had no say in terms of voting, but they would not. We had my first short film that I co-directed with an old friend of mine, Adele Pham. was about a volunteer, a Japanese volunteer who knocked on over 1,000 doors for the Obama campaign. Um, and those stories will always stick with me because it just shows the diversity of support that he had and what it meant to the world that someone like Barack Obama could become president. And I remember the night that he became president, it was probably the most magical night of my life
Yeah.
because we had put in so many hours of hard work. Like we were working 80 hours a week, 7 days a week, for from I started in June up until November, right? Nonstop. And we didn't care. We loved it. We would meet people old and young, all different races, creeds, genders, sexualities, and it was just something that was really beautiful that I don't know if I'll ever experience again in my lifetime.
As I listen to your stories, I think about my 15-year-old self because you've mentioned that a few times. And when I think back on my 15-year-old self and I would read about men and women that inspired me at 15, I would, if I would be reading about somebody like you with all the accomplishments that you've done, I always would think that guy's a filmmaker. Like he studied film and he went off to make a few movies and it just got better and better and better. But what the difference between being a 15-year-old and a 45-year-old today, that 30 years, what I'm beginning to really understand now is if that is a good filmmaker, if that's a good chef, if that's a good anything, typically there's so many more experiences that help inform the art that you do so well. And it's proving that you need to have such a diverse experience of a, a diverse amount of life experience to create um, products or anything that's impactful for the human journey.
Yeah, I think Shakespeare says like what's past is prologue, and I think what's past is so much more than prologue, right? Like everything we experience from our past informs who we are. Um, it 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 molds us more than just what a prologue would do, and what we do now is so formative to what our future is going to be.
Yeah.
And even when we look at our past, we're talking about things in our past, my past, for this particular uh, conversation. It makes you think about the present and the meaning that everything forms into the present too, right? And they all oscillate between time and space in many ways. And I think even in the work that I want to tell today, the idea of like reimagining our past and our past experiences and remembering those experiences and bringing them into the present and giving them value and meaning to today's generation and today's audiences is so important. I think that's why I'm such a proponent and advocate for representational stories, because the idea of like seeing yourself and the value of seeing your experience that you grew up in, it it makes you feel more seen today as well, right? It's You might for the longest time not think of what you did when you were younger as having any impact or having any value, or what your parents did, or those little moments of joy or love that they gave were kind of nothing. But if we are able to reframe those little actions and those little stories that maybe we took for granted when we were younger and place meaning in them now through whatever art we're creating or the conversations that you're having with your guests, then that's part of sort of the experience of being an artist, being Vietnamese in many ways.
We have begun to talk uh, recently in the last maybe 2 years about ritual and tradition. And before that, um, I was very turned off by those things. Those very words, ritual, just makes me check out. And as the last maybe 7 years of vacationing with you and your family, my family, all vacation together, there's a sort of uh, deep respect that you have for holiday traditions and the way we organize the dishes that come out, and the way we clean up the table and the way we put out the Thanksgiving food and the spread and make things look beautiful over Christmas, over the meals that we've shared, our families have shared. Um, where did you get that? I mean, did you grow up with a lot of ritual, or how did your family upbringing affect this idea of tradition and ritual?
Well, I think for me, ritual started with the family altar, right? That each Vietnamese family has. And when it was either during Tết or when it was the death anniversary, we would, light incense and we would offer fruit and food to our ancestors. And at the time, I didn't, I was like 4 or 5. They're like, say something to your ancestors. And I'm like, what am I supposed to say? what, where are they? This is freaking me out. Right. But I understood, there's a sense of that's a marker, right? It's an anchor that we can hold on to. And I'm always looking for an anchor. I think that's helped me stay grounded and made me kind of understand life better. And in sort of the short time we have, there are these anchors and markers that we can look back onto that give us the sense of where we are in our life and in our place in life at the in place in time in our timeline. Even though I think our timelines are infinite, but that's another conversation. Um, and so that was my first sense of ritual, right? Um,
Did your
and I
parents celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas and do all the
no,
things
no,
you
they didn't really celebrate Thanksgiving. They did celebrate Christmas though, and every year we would put up a Christmas tree. And the 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 last year that we didn't put up the tree is when my parents got divorced,
do?
and I think that really was devastating for me.
How old
Right?
were you?
12,
Oh shit.
and that was such a joyous time when we
Yeah.
put up the tree together. My dad would come home early for work. My mom didn't put up the tree; she was still at work. She wasn't a she was Buddhist. But it was me, my sister, and my dad. I felt like those were one of the only activities that we did together. Like you could see a beginning, middle, end to that process. My parents would take us out shopping and things like that, but that was, that didn't feel like there wasn't a ritual to that. But the idea of like putting up a tree and like the last thing you put up is that star or that angel and like taking a step back and looking at that tree as a family together and seeing the fruits of our labor and the time we spent together was very meaningful. And it was a shock to me when I was 12 when we didn't do that for the first time, right? And my sister tried to continue that ritual, and it was even harder because she had left for college that same year.
Mm.
So my world turned upside down in many ways, and I kind of felt like without an anchor in my family, even though my family was not necessarily close. Like my sister and I were very close, but we had that anchor of wanting it to put up the Christmas tree. And my sister, I know she got in arguments with me because she didn't understand it too. She's like, "Why do you want to put up the stupid Christmas
Mhm.
tree?" Right? And you know, it was just a symbolic thing in many ways. But it made me understand like that power of ritual and like the meaning of doing something together at a certain time, and reminding ourselves to like take a bit of a pause in a year and days that can kind of um, blend into each other, right? And that's why those markers are again important for me.
You know, it's revealing to hear that story because I think many Vietnamese kids, and I don't know in Vietnam today, but many Vietnamese kids in the US, when their parents heard birthday, the fuck, we don't celebrate birthdays. We mean birthday. Like, there's none of that. For the most part, there wasn't, I think, a tradition of celebrating birthdays in Vietnam. And then I think when I was growing up, it was so silly to even say, "Hey, mom and dad, can I have a birthday party or can I have cake?" Or there was no such thing as birthdays. But has that changed in our culture?
I
I think
mean,
it comes
that
from
what like
the lack of birthday celebrations.
um, I think I don't know. I feel like Vietnamese now, like a modern Vietnamese family, they have bigger birthday parties than we
Oh,
do in
really?
Vietnam. But maybe that's just a kind of a Western influence. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier a little bit about that expectation of our family, of our parents, where we create this mythology of the perfect family, right? And one of the things we're as a filmmaker, when you're writing a script or you're making a documentary, you're the best things to film are ritual, is to film a wedding, a funeral, a birthday, because it's something that can connect to an
Yeah.
audience, but it's something that again is ritualistic and has a sense of grandeur in some ways, and it says a lot. It symbolizes a lot, and because of that, I think growing up when you watch like these American sitcoms, you see the kid's birthday party and something silly happens, right? And I think that idea was ingrained in my head as a little kid. And my parents didn't really remember my birthday. I sort of like had to nudge them and remind them. Um,
Do they remember today?
no, I mean my dad might because it's on Facebook, but my mom, it's like a month later. She's like,
But
"Was it your birthday?"
it doesn't bother you today, does it?
No, because I think I've kind of, um, I would maybe evolved isn't the right word, but I just have less expectation of my parents' relationship, of mine and my parents' relationship, for better for
Worse,
worse.
yeah.
I mean, I'm sure if they wished me a happy birthday, and my dad will probably watch this, or listen to it, but I think I would. My dad wishes me a happy birthday, yeah, on Facebook. Um, but I don't know what the feeling will be like unless it happens. I, I imagine I'd have a feeling of joy if someone wished me a happy birthday. I think most people get that feeling of joy, of somewhat of a validation, um, as as superficial it might sound, but having a friend recognize that you were born on this day, there's little things in life that feel nice, right? Um, but in Vietnam, I think it's crazy how big the birthdays have become in certain families.
It's like Halloween now in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean Halloween's not big as it is like in say New York, where like kids go out.
Yeah.
But I mean that if you want to compete with any other holiday in the world, I think that would win
Yeah.
without any other celebration. And so
God.
it's not just I think it's sort of um it's not fair to say like Vietnamese don't like ritual. It's just like which rituals we actually place our
Yeah,
focus on.
that ritual is one of my favorite by far. Even just the thought of having bánh chưng in the house and the pickled veggies that sit in my kitchen because my mom, brings it, and it brings feelings of joy. And
Why is that ritual different from any other ritual? I mean, when you were starting this sort of topic, it's like you're never into ritual. But if you say you're into that, then you are totally into ritual.
sure, but I think mine comes from a religious sort of a religious upbringing that was not healthy. And I think the idea of ritual and sacraments and I think you've revitalized that part. You and another friend of mine, a dear friend of mine named Tad, has really revitalized this sort of sense of ritual going hand in hand with spirituality. I think that's a necessity. When I was a kid, I went to a boarding school called St. Michael's Prep, and the priests and the brothers would wear these robes that are very similar to the Pope's garb, and it has a little hood. It's all white, and it was a very angelic scene. And we would go in to do evening prayers every night, or on Saturday or Sunday. The priest and brothers would sing in Gregorian chants, and my father used to always say, "You're not going to get this now, but when you get a lot older, you're going to really appreciate these days. So I don't expect you to really appreciate it, but just record what I'm saying." And it's very ritualistic. That part of my life was buried because of my hate for religion at the time. And but now, as I spend more time with you and with Tad, I become more aware of how important this sort of human anchoring is. And one big example is before you really moved to LA, the group of friends that we have were very spread out. And in a very short amount of time, you've managed to organize um, the group outings, the group dinners, the group everything, and sort of put an anchor in the group. And knowing now that you think deeply about these sort of like these ritualistic ways of thinking, partitioning events in your mind, it really just opens up this ability for the whole group to now bond on a very deep level. We have something to kind of look forward to.
Thank you. I mean, I didn't. I thought that's how LA people hung out anyway. So
Weird, right? Not really. It was very random before, and now we rally around birthdays. And I mean, we were all very close, and but we just didn't have a I mean, the Christmas that we just shared together, our big group of friends, everybody was COVID tested, everybody got tested. And you know the the dinner was very special, and it was very special because of the amount of the heavy emphasis, and just sitting together around a big table and eating this beautiful meal that Chef Win Bui put together for us was um, rallying around this sort of idea of anchor. And the more I think about my deep dive into this exercise of of figuring out what it means to be Vietnamese, it 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 now becomes apparent that this idea of having ritual, whether it's religious or cultural, is vital to human existence.
yeah, I I think it goes back to your memories of like, yeah, that, right? And that has always been a gathering place for Vietnamese families. And I think the idea of a meal has been a gathering place for all families of all different cultures for since the beginning of time, right? And we're starting to lose that as a society. We're starting to lose the art of gathering, the art of appreciating conversation. I'm guilty of this. Of like when I was growing up, my parents would leave on the TV and the news in the background, and we wouldn't talk to each other. Um,
God, that's so sad to think about. It's like the most sad image of a child having to watch TV and not engaging with the parents that are in the same room, but in essence, right?
Yeah. But at the same time, I was grateful that we were all eating to get dinner together. 'Cause
Wow.
some people didn't have that privilege either, right? Some kids would just watch TV by themselves and eat dinner.
I'm just have to share this very proud thing about my family. My father and mom made sure we had dinner every night together, and there was no TV. The four of us would eat. My father was so funny sometimes that literally when he cracked a joke or we cracked a joke, I don't know if it was on purpose or what, but many times he would be on the floor holding his stomach and laughing. And the floor at our house was really dirty because, it's just so much traffic in and out. He would be on the floor, and sometimes I would be peeing in my pants at dinner because we couldn't hold our laughter. I mean, that's sort of the family, and I always thought that every family was like that, and the more I've gone out and talked to people like you, and it's just such a sad and just when I think about that, I think, and I'm not trying to change other people's way of life, but it is you and I talk about this too. It's not a segue, but it's building on top of this whole idea of like cultures, and I won't say what culture, but a lot of cultures that have dinners together and really talk to their children and just engage. And my wife and I, we talk about this constantly. It's so difficult to be present, so difficult to just put my phone down and engage with my children. And I know they only have a short amount of time with me. They're on loan with for just a short amount of time. But even knowing that it's a short temporary thing, having that phone or drifting off mentally, it's so much easier than engaging with each other and talking to each other.
Yeah, I think it's telling that our most recent president would often eat alone, watch the news, eat dinner by himself, and President Obama would make it he would stop every meeting, he would make sure, like, 6:30, he'd go and have dinner with his 2 children and his wife, and nothing could change that in the 8 years that he was president, right? If he was in DC and they were in the same city, they would always have dinner together.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's very telling. Yeah, very telling. My wife is just very strict about being at home at 5 to 8 or 9 when the children go to bed. And I'm beginning to see the logic and the strength that it has given me and just my own personal life to follow and adhere to that, because that is an anchor, that's a ritual that's so important to the development of these little people that we're raising.
Yeah, I think they talk about this. I might be going off on a kind of a tangent here, but, like, the idea of symmetry in nature is also a tenet of beauty that people equate that with beauty. And the idea of symmetry is having something like a circle is like kind of the perfect form of symmetry, right? Because if you rotate a circle, even though the points within that circle change from your viewpoint, your perspective, that circle looks exactly the same. And there's a beauty in that idea, right? I think that's the same when you think about how we live our lives, in that the idea again of something that can anchor us, that reminds us of something familiar. Familiarity is something that I think creates a sense of security and comfort for us and for children. And the 6 p.m. dinner is sort of like a symmetry of life. I think a symmetry of the day that helps us and gives us, yeah, a bit of of yeah, just something that we're looking for in order just to feel joy in some ways and feel beauty.
Mhm. You know, sounds funny when I say Confucius said or Confucius says, but Confucius did
All
say,
right, Bruce Lee.
uh, if you can't basically take care of your family, then how do you take care of the city? If you can't take care of the city, how of the world? And it's true. It's true on every level. And I think taking care of our family first, taking just being there and being present. It is one of the most hardest thing to do in any society. I don't think it's just the U.S. or Vietnam, or I'm sure everybody deals with that struggle to be a part of our um, our children's life. But but this is why I bring it up. You have turned out to be the the poster child of being able to be present with your friends, right? When you're with me or when you're friends, you're able to really be present and have a real conversation. But yet you weren't raised with that. How did you arrive at it? So my question, I always ask my guests this too. It's like, okay, so let's give pressure points to our kids. Let's like put them in hard spots, or maybe not do it intentionally, but when they do go through these hard times and pressures, or a lack of parents and having watched TV and eat dinner by themselves, does it spur, does it create a, a product or a kid or a child or a human that eventually balances the symmetry out in the long run, right? Or does it just depend? I mean, am I going to give my children all of this like 5, 6 o'clock attention for dinner, and then they're just going to turn out to be like they take it for granted, and then just turn out to be empty, you know, empty bozos in their mind because they've had so much privilege of having a father and a mom that really checked in? Or is it like Bao Nguyen? He went through some crazy pressure or lack of family connection at dinner or whatnot, and but you turned out to be even more anchoring in so many families that I know that grew up with complete households.
Well, I mean, I should give a lot of credit to my sister
Mm,
and my relationship with her, and she was very much my anchor growing up. And so even though, yeah, I wouldn't consider my childhood to be bad in any ways. My family, my parents worked hard to put food on our table, to give us shelter, and they gave us love in the way that they knew it. And so my recollection of these experiences is not meant to be some critique of their
right.
parenting, but it makes me realize, like, it, it's again, hate to keep on using the word formative, but it forms me, and it forms like who I aspire to be, or what I believe um, is the path that I would like to take as a caregiver, as a parent one day. But yeah, my sister was helped teach me compassion, and also honestly, the church taught me a lot of these things.
Mm,
And even though I'm not a practicing Catholic today, I think the morality, the allegories that I was taught when I was young gave me this moral objectivity, this sense of compassion that I carry with me today. And I don't, I don't um, pretend like I know the answer to. I mean, sometimes I pretend like I know the answer to a lot of things, but I'm trying to change that about myself as well. Um, I am trying to be more curious and less like certain about things. But yeah, this is I don't know what type of parent I'm going to be like. How my experience as a child would make me as a parent. I hope I can be a good parent to my children if I have children one day. But I don't know how I would act. It's like the the question of nurture versus nature, and
yeah.
something that I don't have the answer to really at this point.
You link so many, and I bring this up again. You link so many people up together. I remember a few years back, I needed to take a trip to Bangladesh, and I reached out to. I think I just posted on a Facebook post, and you shot back with a DM right away. I have somebody in Bangladesh, Misha, and you made the introduction. Uh, that move that you did. I mean, I'd always had that kind of respect for you as a connector, but where did you learn how important that kind of stuff is? And that it's a big skill to have, and I think it is almost the foundation of filmmaking aside, your skills aside. I want to almost give credit in that department. It's a huge ability. Where did you learn how to do that?
Wait, just to clarify, what's the exact ability that you're speaking of?
To connect, to remember how important human connection is, and referring one good friend to another good friend. I mean, that's a very rare quality because people are typically just like, oh, I don't want to make any connections. I mean, I just want to keep the connections to myself. But you've always seemed to put people into contact with other people and having that faith that people are inherently good people. Is the
Um,
root of that? Where did that come from? The Obama campaign, or
no, and I had never thought about it as like something that was like unique to
I
me.
can tell you it's rare. I've been in the world of business for many years. People are very they hold those cards very close to themselves, and it's rare when you meet people who are very open and free to hand out contacts and make connections beyond your.
Um, I mean, I think if someone is my friend, I would like them to meet my other friends around the world. And I know what it means to like, I've been in the place where I've gone to a new country without knowing anyone and someone connecting me. And the idea of welcoming a stranger to a new place, if I can help make that easier for a friend, then there's no downside to that for me at whatsoever. Uh, to
There
make
is a
someone,
kind of a downside if you think of it. There's multiple downsides. What if one guy doesn't hold up the end of the bargain and is embarrassing, you because you made the connection? That's one downside. The other downside is like, I'm going to hook up somebody else with a contact that I worked very hard to kind of retain for 8 years, and I'm just going to give a lot of people. So there are downsides. I mean, to there's a science. You know what it is? Game theory. I think we can go back to that. There's got to be some game theory that you've always talked to me about connecting people, because it's not a normal trait.
well, I mean, I'm trying to think. I
Maybe
mean,
I
to
can
be honest,
understand a lot of it. Yeah.
it could be a vanity thing, to be honest, to show that I know a lot of people around the world. Just being completely
Yeah.
transparent, that could be a thing.
Very honest answer.
Yeah, but I, we talk about this idea of reciprocity versus being transactional. I think if I can be my brother's keeper, then someone else will also be my brother's keeper. If that's a reciprocity I see in that, of like if someone is, I don't want my friend to get these are, and we're speaking specifically about friends, right? I vouch for you and I vouch for Misha, and I knew you would get along. I don't randomly say you should meet this person because you're going to be in the same town. I think you would get along with this person, and they also happen to be in the same place.
Mm.
Um, so in that sense, but I also want to surround myself with friends that I can always vouch for, right?
Yeah.
Why would you? I mean, I try to, yeah, my circle of friends are people that I love and that I think that my other friends will also love.
I think that you have this perspective on Vietnam because you've lived there for a long time, and this idea of separating sort of like your Americanism when you lived in Vietnam. You made sure that you didn't taint the waters or taint the people that you hung out with. with your American ideals, or you were able to very smoothly sort of blend in and leave the Western kind of culture. You were very mindful of it.
Okay. Well, let's to think about it in sort of a comparative sense of like when you walk into someone's home, do you critique their decor? Do you go into their cupboard and critique what they have in there? It's like a sign of respect when you walk into someone's home.
Sure.
And the same reason that Asians take off their shoes is a sign of respect to that person, right? Of that home, right? They are not going to bring the dirt from outside into your shelter. And so I look at it whenever I try to like think of my opinion on some of these larger issues that society wants me to have an opinion on. It goes back to like what are my values on a very granular level. And when I go to a country, I respect their culture and their that I'm a visitor into that place.
We are in essence visitors everywhere we go, right?
Sure. But I think that one of the reasons I returned to America is that I'm staking this as my home, restaking it as my home, reclaiming it as my home.
You've lived on the East Coast. You've lived in New York. You lived on the West. You're now living on the West Coast. You lived in Vietnam. What are um, what are the really the real differences of the three places that you've lived? Like, I've always had a lot of respect for guys from the East Coast. I tell you that all the time. There's a sense of seriousness. There's a tradition, and I think out here in the West Coast we're a lot more just relaxed. But in your mind, what are the profound differences between living in these three places?
Yeah. I should add, I lived in London too, and now you found out I lived in Kyrgyzstan, and I did live
Mm.
in Italy very briefly too. So, I mean, every place has their differences. I think that's the beauty of living in different places, right? I mean, specifically America. I don't know if I experienced the West Coast enough since I moved here during a pandemic. So that's a very different way to enter into any space is through um, a moment of pain and urgency and tragedy, right? Um, I mean, to say that though, the second week I moved to New York was September 11th, so I did move there when it was very much a place of tragedy, but it turned into a place of resiliency for me because I stayed there 12 years after September 11th, like for a long time, and that's why I fell in love with New York is that I saw that sense of we're gonna rebuild after this. We're not gonna sort of let this become our identity as a city that is only affected by 9/11, but what happens more, it's a city that's affected by the days after. Um, I think on a very sort of um, again superficial level, people think that East Coast and especially New York is a very you know entrepreneurial city. It's a hustle and city of hustle and bustle, city without much pause. And for me, the West Coast is a city, or the West Coast in Los Angeles is a city of pause comparatively.
Mm.
The city where you're, it's obviously spread out geographically compared to New York, and I think I'm very much into how cities are designed and how that
Yeah.
influences the way that people live in that design. And I think because of that, I came here because I knew I had a group of friends that I could kind of bypass the 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 negative effects of living in a very sprawling city because I didn't need to make friends or immediately, and I didn't have to have that obstruction. New York, it's much easier to make friends. It's still difficult because the city is so large and it's always moving so quickly. Um, and in Vietnam, I I sort of came into Vietnam with a serious relationship that became my anchor for better or for worse when I was there. And from there, I kind of sprouted into other sort of friendships. Um, but I'm not really answering your question. Well, in some ways I am, but
Yeah, well,
it's a very broad question to
yeah,
answer.
and I'm leading into another question because I think the 3 or 4 places that you've spent a lot of time, I think that there's a next stage that you've talked about. This idea of, the idea of being able to create in a space now where there's not a lot of distraction, namely the desert. Can you tell me a little bit about your attraction to, one place in particular is the deserts out here in California. Can you go into a little bit about your vision for living or building something out there?
Sure. I should prefix by saying the first time he took me out to the desert, I hated it. And I remember we were like driving past. We were on the 10, driving past the windmills and
Yeah.
the turbines, right? And you're like, oh, it's so beautiful out here. And I was like, it's so barren. Is like my first reaction because my idea of nature, again, it's like, yeah, East Coast mentality where it's about abundance and density and lush forest, right? And the desert is the opposite of that. Um, but over time, this past year, spending more time in the desert and being able to see sort of um, the sky and the whole landscape in one view is something that's a different experience for me. And um, I, as a filmmaker, as an artist, I'm always thinking about how I create the optimal space for my mind to create, like the idea of having something that's blank that I can, you know, paint my canvas on, figuratively. So the desert to me is almost like this Thoreauvian retreat, right? To get away from the sprawl of an urban environment like LA and give myself a refuge. And I look back at the artists that I admire the most who had these type of retreats, and I'm very much a student of history of like these artists didn't, you know, they there was a reason they were great artists, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier, even of like intention and did I know if I was or the process. And I think you create an optimal environment for your process to strive, and you know your process, and you know how you work, and you know what you need to make what you consider your best art. And in many ways, people who know me, I'm very, I have minor obsessive compulsive disorder where I like to see things in parallel lines, or I don't like to see a lot of clutter. And I think it just, especially when I'm writing, I like the idea of like the only thing that I see is what's in my brain. I'm going to put it onto the page or put it onto a screen. And that's how I felt. I mean, not everyone works in the same way. But I hope that by creating this retreat, this refuge, there are other artists who I can create a community for in the future who are looking for the same thing.
Why is that important to have, a place to have these artists come in and be together?
Um, I think a sense of community for me is super important in not just being an artist, but just being a human being. Um, I I I don't consider myself an extrovert. Some people I mean, you can answer this after if you consider me an extrovert, but I like a healthy exchange of ideas and sharing of experiences, and I think conversation is a way to spark creativity and inspiration. And I like to kind of learn from people around me, and um, hopefully, make it reciprocate those ideas, and what people teach me, I can teach them or create partnerships. And I very much know that filmmaking is a collaborative art form. So there's many places that I can form collaboration and community. It's I think it's helpful to not just for my own art, but the art of as a community. Um, and in a way, I think about legacy a lot, but not legacy in well, this would be sort of a physical legacy, but um, there's a quote from like James Baldwin, who's like probably my favorite writer, and he talks about his mortality. And I'm sort of paraphrasing this quote. Like he said, um, when you look through the wreckage and rubble, when someone's digging through the ruins of my life, I pray that somewhere in those ruins, in that wreckage, they'll find me, and that they'll find something useful in that wreckage that I've left behind, right? And I think about that when I'm creating art and when I'm creating films, is that in the stories that I want to tell, there's something in those stories that when I pass away, when I'm not here, that someone finds meaning in that story, in that, again, those ruins and wreckage I left behind. And maybe the space in the desert is a physical manifestation of that idea in many ways.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thought, for me to even sit here and visualize what that means, out in the desert, Joshua Tree or Palm Desert or Palm Springs. It makes me think about, our friend Stefan. I bring him up in a lot of the podcasts, and what kind of influence he had on our group. And it's like, in many ways, when people say, say their name, so it doesn't be forgotten. Issa and I were just talking about that in another episode too. We talked at length about his influence on our group, and how, even though he's gone, he's left such a beautiful imprint on all of us who got the privilege to be near him and around him. What are your God, I don't even know how to ask this, because it's just it's so personal what you and I went through during the morning that you called. But I want to attribute a lot of the opportunity that I had, and I can say this too because you were there with me, on a specific project. I think, I was in and out of the film business, and Stefan really wanted to make sure that I was attached to, something that he was writing, and he wanted to have Anderson attached, and made sure that we were on the team. And you are a young filmmaker starting out, and he put you on the project, for Saigon Yo. And I will always thank him for that. For it could have gone many ways, because he was already an award-winning filmmaker, and he could have just didn't need to honor his word. But time and time again, he just made sure that Anderson and I were always on that project to make sure that it moved along. And he gave us sort of the keys to the car to say, hey, drive me to the place where it needs to go. And that sense of community of bringing you, Elizabeth I, Danny Doe, and Anderson and Michael, community, and your James Baldwin quote of the wreckage. It's not even a wreckage. His life wasn't, a wreckage at all. It was, in fact, a very beautiful life. And I never want to forget that. And having this opportunity to talk to you, I just wanted to ask you to share some thought um, about Stefan Gauger?
Well, I'll share like the first time I met Stefan because it's a funny story. Try to lighten up this conversation a bit. But Stefan had just come out with Al the Sparrow, and I was a young filmmaker in New York. I didn't know any other Vietnamese filmmakers except for like a couple. And I remember like seeing his. I had a subscription to like Movie Filmmaker magazine or something like that. And I remember he did an interview, and I was like, "Oh my god, this guy like made Al the Sparrow. It's a great film." Um, and I was so eager to meet him one day, and I was lucky enough to go out to the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival for this project that I did. And I remember opening night, I met Stefan, and I was like so starstruck. And after the opening night party, we wanted to go to the after party, and he's like, "Oh, just ride with me." And I was like, "Oh my god, like he just like that nice of a guy to like let me come and ride with him." And we were walking to his car, and I was expecting, I was like, I didn't know better. I was like, oh, filmmakers, directors must make so much money. And I was expecting like a nice BMW or Mercedes. And then it's like his broken down, what kind of car was it? Like a Forerunner or like it
Big
was like
Land Cruiser or something.
Land Cruiser that was like probably like 15 years old and broken down. And,
Full of
you
cigarettes.
know, yeah. And in the passenger seat, when I got in, he had like tons of just like clothes on it, and he's just like, "Hey, don't worry, I'll move it to the back seat." Just throws it to the back, and it definitely changed my perception of what a filmmaker was, and in a beautiful way. That sense of like of of humility, modesty, and we often say that Stefan really had no ego, and I think that was a beautiful thing. That even with a film like Saigon Yo, he gave me a chance. I didn't have much experience at all, but I think he just knew that he was going to spend a summer in Vietnam, and he wanted to make a film with his friends. And like we've lost that spirit of filmmaking nowadays, right? We're just thinking about points and box office and who's going to watch it and what camera we're going to use, and less about the process, like how much joy we'll get in making the film. And he made films with so much joy,
Did.
and that's such a beautiful legacy that he imparted on me. That's part of something with the James Baldwin quote that when I look through. And right, the idea of wreckage and ruin is obviously a figurative term. So that in my searching through the ruins of my experiences with Stefan, that's something that he left behind with me.
And in this sort of passing on, we all, there was a few of us that got together to put together a company after his death. Um, the spirit of community, the spirit of getting together and having a good time, um, is why we all got together, right? For our company, East Films. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey?
Um, it's a bit hazier for me, honestly. It feels like a long time ago. I think you know you and I had separate conversations. Anderson and I had separate conversations. Me, Lin Fancine, Ham Chun, we're all directors. We were living in Vietnam at the same time. Wanted to form like a Three Amigos type of collective based on, the Three Amigos of Mexican cinema. And I think with Stefan's death, it was a wake up call in many ways that why aren't we doing this sooner? Why aren't we, um, you know, codifying this group? And so, I think that was how East was born, and it was just a natural um, idea um, to to ask Jenny Chang Lei to join and Lee Ngo because they were part of that collective, and so yeah, that's how East was formed, and it's very much with Stefan's spirit.
It's it's a huge um, honor for me to sit with you in the last few hours to talk about anything I wanted to talk about. And I thank you for indulging me and opening up. And I know we're gonna have plenty more chances to um, get back on something, and hopefully we'll cover film or not. But I thoroughly have enjoyed being able to really open it up and talk about things that were responsible for your development. That's always been my I've always been curious about how you've been how were you shaped to become the person that you are, and you've affected my life in many ways that I will continue. You and Anderson, when it comes to my life in the business of what we do, um, have really affected my trajectory, and obviously with Stefan as well. So I thank you for all of those years, and I thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. I, you know, you're one of the most generous people I know. Very kind, and with this podcast, I think curious, and I think curiosity is something that's important in our society that's often forgotten. I think we come in with a lot of assumptions of what we know about people, the world, about experiences, but I value your how much how much you're curious about life and about people around you, and I think that's one of your greatest qualities. I love that about you, Ken. So thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
I appreciate that very much, and have a wonderful, happy New Year. Chúc mừng năm mới, as we say.
Okay, chúc mừng năm mới.